speak loud. But anyway, okay, it's just too many technical things. Good morning to everyone. I would like to thank you all for coming. As my understanding is that the majority here are social workers, practitioners, and I'm really honored to speak before them about a topic that was very actual and current in my country, not just after the war, but even today. And I think it's not the issue that you deal in practice with only in my country, but everywhere in the world, and especially it's a hot topic in Europe again. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me and hosting here in this beautiful town. And so even though it's a very difficult and heavy topic, as we would say, but for the morning, but we as social workers, we just simply deal with things, we don't ask questions, and we improvise whenever it's needed, and it's all about the people. So, all right, I'll start with this. As you can see, my name is Vesna. Don't worry about the surname, it's just too complicated. In our language, it's just a name. In some other languages, like Russian, it means spring, but that's not the topic here. I'm coming from the university, but I do have practical experience immediately after the war when former Yugoslavia broke down from Bosnia, because I'm coming from Banja Luka, which is a town in the northern part of Bosnia. The entity, as it's called, Republic of Srpska. Okay, so it's me actually changing this. I'm waiting for. All right, just a little bit about where I'm coming from. And when I was traveling here, I just thought, all right, this is something that we started to deal with in Bosnia 20 years ago. And we are still in Europe and in the world, we're still dealing with the same issues. And in terms of civilization issues, we are actually staying there for hundreds and hundreds of years. And that's a question that we all have to ask ourselves. Okay, just to have a short picture of the difficult country of Bosnia and Herzegovina as we are, thanks to, I would say, politicians, including international community as well. So we have three constitutive peoples, Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats, and we are divided in two entities by the Dayton Peace Agreement. As you know, that's the agreement that brought peace in former Yugoslavia, especially in Bosnia, plus District Brčko. So in one entity, which is the northern part, it's Republic of Srpska, and the eastern part, this part is Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, where majority of people are Croats and Bosniaks. So the government of Republic of Srpska is centralized, but for Federation they have 10 cantons. So each canton has its own government and parliament, and as you can imagine, we have so many politicians in this country, and we are just population-wise 3.5 to 4 million people. It's amazing how it works at all. So according to the World Bank information back in 2005, during the war from Bosnia and Herzegovina, 1.5 million people migrated, which is approximately close to 40% of the total population. So that was a big migration. Putting that in context, in today's context, we can think also about the Syrians and people from Afghanistan and all the movements happening. The consequences are like long-term consequences. It's not just about changing the way of life or the country in which they live. It's more than that. Okay, I better go faster. All right, so we have this migration. Is that me? Okay. All right, okay. The migration, so as you can see, in 3 years, we had 1.2 million refugees and 1 million displaced. Terms-wide, refugees and displaced person is not the same. Displaced person is a person that migrated within the same country, while the refugees are the people migrating outside of their own country. So 50% migrated from Bosnia. Okay, so what we had to deal with, and this is immediately after the war, we didn't have this problem during the war, but in the late 90s, beginning of 2000. And I will say this because I know for sure, because I was part of the whole process. At the time, I used to work for the United Nations. And for some reason, all the international community, NATO and the United Nations, there was this need to have entertainment and whatever. And that's how the need for the ladies working in the nightclubs actually arose in our country. So why research human trafficking from the social perspective, social work perspective? I did this research, and my main goal was to, first of all, practitioners had big problems dealing with the issue, so I wanted to assess the mechanisms and processes that's supposed to provide social reaction, like the responsible reaction from the society and the government, and different social actors that are involved. And as you know, it would be police, it would be prosecutor's office, it would be social workers, language assistants, because many from foreign countries, victims were in Bosnia at the time. So through different processes, I will go through the processes during the presentation, so I'll just go further. So as a topic, for me, it was interesting because it was a new research topic in the field of social work, and a new field in which social workers intervene in Bosnia. It was new for the practitioners in Bosnia to deal with victims of trafficking. And we'll see what are all the problems. All right, definitions are very important because they are the ones that guide us and tells us and are incorporated into the laws and tells us what we can do and what we cannot do. So definitions are important, and we have all these, the whole world dealt with this issue back in 2000s. And so we have this Palermo Protocol, then the European Commission in year 2004 defined human trafficking. Why is it important? Because we have to differ it from illegal migration, from prostitution, because many people mix this term of prostitutes and victims of human trafficking. There's a huge difference there. And so all these definitions are important. So as for the social work, one of the main tasks of the social work, regardless what category of people we're talking about or our clients, is to introduce and implement changes in social situations in order to change the social society approach towards different social problems. So this was an issue for social work. Changes in focus from social work with clients to social work with individuals. There's a big difference here, and I know that you know this, that every individual has different needs, has different capacities, potentials, and we have to have this approach with the client, with the individuals. So my theoretical framework, I won't just bore you with the theories, but for me, coming from theoretical framework of social work as social reaction on different deviations. That's what I use in phenomenon on human trafficking, like ecological perspective on deviations and structural functional perspective on deviations. So relevant models in social work. Treatment was system approach with families, family orientation, some concepts of feministic paradigms that were used, and empowerment model, because it's all about the empowering people in the process of recovery and reintegration. This term reintegration, it's very interesting, and it was to me during my research, because what I realized that we cannot talk about the reintegration when the actual victims of human trafficking were socially excluded. They were not integrated in the society at all. So now we're talking about reintegrating them. They were not integrated at all. This is what we're going to face with all this migration crisis in Europe, because we'll have governments talk about people being integrated in the society. It's a term that we have to think about it. Integration, inclusion, etc. Okay, all right. I'm not gonna use much of your time, like the methodology that I used. I already mentioned what was the reach. So, as I said, 2 topics of social work, being a research in the field of social work and a field in which social workers intervene. I did use all the methods for this research that are methodology. As you know, we need to have that to have a real situation. So my population was 150. I had to do, due to this complex administrative and legislative situation in Bosnia, because social welfare falls under the jurisdiction of entities and cantons. So in population of close to 4 million people, we would have 1 in each entity, plus all the cantons, so 14 different laws in social welfare, etc. So it gets very complicated, and especially in the new field of social workers, you can only imagine how difficult it was for practitioners back in the 2000s when they had to deal with the victims of human trafficking. They didn't know what does the law say, what can I do and what can I not do, can I do this or that, like you have to have this framework. Okay. So these were the main routes of human trafficking in Balkans. The victims were mainly coming from Romania, Ukraine, Moldavia, foreign victims at the time, going through Hungary and Belgrade and coming to Bosnia. So on the other map you can see the map of Bosnia. So it was also placed, and that was one of the earliest maps. They were placed close to the main field offices and headquarters of the international community at the time. So we're talking UN and NATO. All right, total number of identified victims, which is another term that I have to explain. When we say identified victims, that means that the victim agreed to testify before the court. So, internationally speaking, if the victim does not agree to testify before the courts, then it cannot get this, even though it's a label of being a victim of human trafficking, which then triggers all the rights according to different documents. So this is a very bad situation for people finding themselves in this situation, because most of the time they are very traumatized, plus they fear from the traffickers for their lives, for the lives of their families. So this is another issue, even an ethical issue at the global level. So in 10 years, we had 1,100 victims of human trafficking. So what happened? It was a big challenge but the majority of victims were foreign citizens, which is again, so this is how we started to tackle this problem in Bosnia. As you can see, like so, until 2003-04, ratio between identified, again, so we're talking only about the victims that agreed to, I have to stress this out, that agreed to testify before the courts. If the victim is just scared and she said, I just want to go home, I don't want anything from you, like I didn't even know how I ended up here, and that was usually the case, they send them back home and that's it. They were never registered as victims of trafficking. So if we're talking in terms of social pathology, we can multiply this number by 5, which is the dark figure in social pathology. All right, so until the 2004 and 5, the majority were foreign victims, and then from 2005 onwards, even today, the majority of victims that we deal in Bosnia are domestic, so citizens of Bosnia. Another increasing trend is the number of children victims of human trafficking. From 2005 to 10, we can see the increase of the children being in the red at this graphicon. All right, so this is how it looked like until 2008, and I will explain why until 2008. Thanks to social workers saying that, all right, we have to deal with this, we don't know what to do, there's just too many of them, and all right, the government has to find a way. And this, I'm talking about this topic because it's a good example in Bosnia due to the specificity and the complex administration. All right, so these little dots represent the individual needs and differences between the clients, and that's when, in social work, when we cannot put our clients into some kind of box, then it gets difficult and it might be messy. We're not sure whether we're doing the right thing, what do they have the right for according to this law and that law, so we tend to put clients in different boxes. With victims of trafficking, that's just not impossible. So the only box that we started with in Bosnia was, okay, we have foreign victims and we have domestic victims. All right, what's the other boxes that we can put them? Then we said, okay, we have identified victims, the ones that agreed to testify, and the ones that don't want to testify, so they get deported straight away. And then we had different organizations. Not social welfare, of course, was all these levels, BNH, entity, canton, municipalities. Then they came up with this, okay, who's going to pay for the costs for deportation, for keeping them? Like the issues that we're dealing with, again, I'm mentioning this crisis, migration crisis that we have in Europe. And then they say, okay, who's going to pay for the food? Who's going to pay for their staying in camps? And that's, when we talk about the money, that's where the government starts thinking, all right, this is coming out of our pocket now and our budget, now we have to do something. Same with here. So according to the international laws, the government had to pay for foreign victims staying in Bosnia and traveling back home after they were deported. Of course, after they finish all their testimonies before the courts and they get even more traumatized. And then there were NGOs. They did a great deal in terms of working with victims of trafficking, because they were the ones that actually saw the problem before the government, before the victims came to the social workers working in the public security social work centers. That's where the NGOs were, and we're talking about the internationally organized NGOs dealing with this, with the victims of human trafficking. So I must say that if only the government realized that they can lean on these NGOs before, a long time before, they are now, because they have specialized contracts with the NGOs. Okay, so that was a big mess. So what we came up with was it was interdisciplinary approach, and again, this was suggested from the academic community and a team in which I was also involved, and the social workers working in practice, not just in public sector, but also in NGO sector. And again, I must say that they did a great job and still doing. So we appointed a state coordinator, and we said, okay, we don't care which nationality he is, whether he or she is Muslim, Croat, or Serb, this doesn't matter at all. And that was for the first time after the war. Then we had regional monitoring teams, which were engaged in identification of victims, escorting to the shelter, which was organized and kept by the NGOs that had special contracts with the government. Information management and cooperation with other partners, because it's very important to manage the information, because the least that we wanted to do is to interview the victims of human trafficking by one professional, and then 3 days later another one is coming and say, okay, we need to talk to this victim, this is organized crime going around, we can get this big fish and blah blah blah. So we as social workers were the only one, and at this point, social workers working in NGOs were the only one that protected the victims of human trafficking. All right, as I said, NGOs and other partners are providing shelter, and social welfare centers at the time, even though they were obliged to undertake prevention activities, to do the diagnosis, assessment of the needs, treatment and counseling, at the time, until 2008, there was nothing done there. So this was the formula that we started with, and it actually worked. But when I did this research, again, in terms of the forms of services like shelter, medical care and support, assistance, psychological, legal aid and support, and employment, because you would have victims that are afraid to go back to their countries, and they seek asylum and they wanted to stay in Bosnia. So what happens in that case? They needed a support to get employment, and we're talking about the post-war country with unofficial unemployment rate up to 60-70%. I think it's now so as well. So as you can see, just briefly, so social welfare centers were still not involved in 2008. 74% never provided shelter, so it was all done by the NGOs. Then Medicare, okay, but this part, professional training, employment support, family mediation, as you can see, social welfare centers were like 76, approximately 80 to 90% not involved, never involved in this kind of providing this kind of service to victims of trafficking. What was the social welfare center's participation in treatment in terms of counseling with families, group therapy activities, and occupancy therapy? Again, as we can see, over 50% and in occupancy 70% had no experience with providing this kind of service with victims of trafficking. Okay, we have these processes, separate processes, even though rehabilitation, resocialization are very much connected and overlapping. But then we had this repatriation, and this is only for the foreign victims of human trafficking, where they had to be repatriated to their country of origin. I'll just add that at the time, Bosnia and Herzegovina was for some reason country of destination, but now it's more a country of origin. What was the participation of social welfare centers during these processes? And again, as we can see, not much involved still, and I'll explain why it was the case and what changed since then. reintegration process, which is the most important process, and very much social work. It's about social work, working in communities, or community social work, and it's got its 4 dimensions. There are different definitions and different opinions on this, but again, 58% had no experience in this, and this is pure social work. All right, so this is just instead of conclusion, and I'll finish shortly. Current situation is that human trafficking statistically exists as of 1999, and in the past 5 years or past 10 years now, most of the victims are domestic victims, so we have a lot of repatriation process coming from abroad. Social workers from some European countries contacting social workers in Bosnia saying, okay, we have this victim of human trafficking, it's your citizen, we have to repatriate, and then you have to work as practitioner to reintegrate or integrate this person. Usually they're coming from socially excluded category of population. This partners networking is very important. Formally started a process that demanded more active participation of social welfare systems. So what we have now, I'll just get you back to the first slides, and as you could see that we had 13 governments and different laws, etc. So now we had at the entities laws social welfare, victims of human trafficking being included in the social welfare law as a specialized category. So now it's not a problem for the practitioner to say, all right, this is, according to the law, this is a client of social work, these are the rights, and this is what we can do. So before, it was not possible. So social workers simply didn't know what to do with the victims of human trafficking, just even in terms of determining which rights do this person have. Education of social workers, in which I'm very active in the past 10 years, but we started officially in cooperation with other universities and different NGOs and police and prosecutor's office. It's an interdisciplinary approach since 2010, and the process has not been finished, so there is no evaluation, but there was another ground that we used, lobbying for the victims of human trafficking to be introduced to the new law that was brought last year, as not year before, 2013, as a special category. My critical reflection was that these etiology factors, like poverty, migration, different other different etiology factors, recognized in post-war country, in this context require more active role of society and state in order to reduce their impact and to reduce possibilities for recruitment of new victims or re-victimization, which is very much happening all the time. Social welfare centers officially exist as partners, but participation in these interdisciplinary teams and work with victims in practice depends on the individual activities. Now we're trying to tackle this issue with the education for social workers. So we have in 74 municipalities in Bosnia and Herzegovina, 74 public social welfare centers. Each welfare center has one person, one social worker appointed to deal with victims of human trafficking, and they are the ones that are getting education. So we have a specialized person in each public security center. Where we still have a problem is if we have a domestic victim of human trafficking that was identified, let's say at the age of 17, it's still a child, considered a minor, and by the time she gets through the process of rehabilitation and other processes, she turns 18. And by the law, social workers are not obliged to provide any other support unless it's under the different categories. So in this category, so this is still a problem, especially because there is a lot of victims of human trafficking coming from the category of people with children with special needs or people with special needs. So then this becomes a really big problem. Okay, my recommendation is it is necessary to intensify these prevention activities and social strategies and programs that anticipate more active role of social welfare representatives, like talking about it in the schools, etc. Formal cooperation of all partners and at the state and regional level requires permanent reviewing. We always have to review and evaluate of the existing action plan. We bring this action plan at the level of Bosnia and Herzegovina for 5 years. Every 5 years that's where we do the assessment. And it is recommended that future researchers include the opinions of victims of human trafficking on protection programs, as well as on individual plans and programs of the reintegration. At this research, I did have my own interviews with the victims of human trafficking, but the sample was not enough to bring some conclusions, so I didn't include that in this research. But again, doing a parallel to what we're facing today in Europe with this migration, it is important to ask people what their needs are, to assess their capacities and to assess their needs before we provide help, because it really wouldn't work unless we ask them what they need. Okay, that's all for me. Thank you very much. I'm open for all your questions. Thank you.
Děkuji. Moje otázka je, zda máte data k současnosti, k obchodu s lidmi. Vy jste říkala, že teď vlastně spíš ten obchod se děje směrem z Bosny do dalších zemí EU. Tak jaké procento se týká prostituce a jaké procento nějaké otrocké práce? A do jakých zemí jsou lidi obchodováni z Bosny především? A pak by mě zajímalo, jestli ten obchod s lidmi je vlastně ten hlavní sociální problém Bosny v současnosti, nebo jsou i jiné věci, které Bosna teď řeší. Děkuji.
Okay, so the data concerning the victims of human trafficking originated from Bosnia, so going somewhere else. Most of that when they get deported, so we have to have in mind that the victim of human trafficking, the number it's not so relevant because it's only those ones that agree to testify before the courts. So they are the only ones that are getting into the records. So the rest we would never have on paper. And there is a lot of, and so we can multiply it by 5. So nowadays we're talking about up to 100 victims of human trafficking that are deported back to Bosnia, and we have some internal as well. Because the modus operandi changed so much. Nowadays, we're talking about still victims of human trafficking, but everything's happening online. It's not so much being a nightclub, so it's very hard even for the police to tackle. And once they assume that there is a victim of human trafficking, they just want to be the first ones to get all the evidence and everything so they can do their part of work in order to combat organized crime, because it's part of the organized crime. But then for the social worker, that is just hell happening. you have a human being that went through all this trauma. You know what you can do, especially nowadays where it's a category in the law. You know what you have to do. And then you have the government saying, okay, this is the priority. You're talking about one victim, and we may catch this organized group that works this way or that way. And that's what the practitioners tell me, that's their biggest problem. The majority, again, your question about where they're going to the European countries, European Union countries, especially that there are different cases. I've heard stories about like things that I would fall on, like I would go definitely. If you're without the work, all right, you speak the language, for example, Italian or French or English, you're a young person in your early 20s. We had cases like that, and they apply for the job that they found an ad. They went through interviews, 3, 4, 5 interviews, and okay, they said, okay, we selected 2 of you, and the next thing, okay, this is the date where we're going to go to the embassy, get the passport and etc., get the visa, everything's organized. You stay in a hotel with these people with suits and ties and like, no, nothing suspicious. And then they ended up in a car boot being sold for 500 euros. That's what we're dealing with. So it's the modus operandi is something that the police is working on, but all the work, the major work has to be done by the social workers in terms of this human being being able to continue or change their lives. That's a big ethical issue in social work. I hope I answered your question. It's a big issue. I can talk about it for days. Okay.
Tak to byla Vesna Sucur-Janjetovic, moc děkujeme a střídá jí Ruth Stark, prezidentka Mezinárodní federace sociálních pracovníků.